Hello and welcome to Scientist Warning TV. And today I'm very pleased to have with me Professor Ben McCall, who's Professor of Sustainability and Chemistry and Executive Director of the Hanley Sustainability Institute at Dayton University, and Professor Tom Murphy, who is Professor in the Physics Department at UCSD and the Associate Director of the Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences. So hello and welcome to you both, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. Now, you're both astrophysicists, and I would not normally be talking with astrophysicists because normally I talk with scientists who are directly involved in climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And you've both refocused your careers in quite radical ways. And I thought it'd be interesting just to ask you both about what you've actually done and what prompted you to refocus your research. So perhaps if I start with you, Ben, because as I understand it, you made this radical change of career direction some years ago?
Yeah, in hindsight, it seems very radical, although I took it rather gradually in a sense. So I started my career at the interface of astronomy and physics and chemistry, and ran a research group at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, studying molecules in the laboratory and in interstellar space, trying to understand their detailed spectral properties and trying to understand how we could use them to understand how stars and planets form. So that's quite a long ways from climate change or resource depletion or any of the issues that I spend my time thinking about right now. And I think what happened was, as a young assistant professor, I started learning about climate change. I started learning about the fact that oil is a finite resource. I mean, all of these things that seem obvious once you acknowledge them, but are not really part of the mainstream scientific discourse, or at least weren't at that time. So I felt compelled to find some way to move in that direction. And it was a real challenge because my original research and my training was completely in a different direction from these topics. But still, I felt morally compelled to devote as much of my life energy as possible to these challenges, because the more I learned about these challenges, the more it seemed like my original research was, while very interesting, almost insignificant in the face of the challenges.
Okay. And that's interesting because you obviously invested a lot in your career up to that point and had considerable success, but at the same time you were noticing that that we are, as we are now, in a planetary emergency. Tom, could you say something about your own journey into this direction as well?
Sure. I started out in graduate school. I was studying colliding galaxies and building instruments for big telescopes, and I loved it. It was just, tons of fun. And then got involved in a project to test general relativity using lasers to the moon, shooting lasers to the reflectors that the astronauts left on the moon, and measuring to 1 millimeter accuracy the distance between Earth and moon to measure the shape of the moon's orbit and see if gravity was behaving like we thought, which has some real fundamental importance in physics. But at the same time, much like Ben, I started a parallel journey where I was learning more about the huge challenges that we're facing this century. That I was aware of climate change and I was aware of finite fossil fuels, but imagine that we had a good number of technological solutions in our pocket that we could just pull out. So I started applying my quantitative skills to try to piece together what we would likely encounter, and also tinkering with my own solar photovoltaic battery systems and just learning the real guts of those systems. And I came out just kind of confused. It's just hard. There's no drop-in replacement. And the more I studied it, the more confused I got, and the more important it seemed. And like Ben, I felt compelled to do something about it, because in the worst case, if we don't acknowledge that our path could be perilous and in a collapse in the worst case, by not acknowledging it, we make it more likely. And in that instance, all of the work that I've invested and all of my colleagues could be flushed down the toilet. So it seemed really important to switch gears and work on something that could salvage the entire, institution.
Yes. So you've both been aware for some time then of the climate and ecological crisis that we're currently in and the trajectory which we're on, which is extremely uncomfortable. But as two senior researchers in North America, what kind of obstacles have you faced in refocusing your careers? Because you'll have a publication track record, you'll have had grant income, credibility and standing amongst your peers. So what kinds of obstacles have you faced in refocusing your careers in this way? Perhaps, Ben, if you would start first.
Sure. Well, I think there are a lot of obstacles that I encountered. And I think the first and foremost one was not knowing what to do or how to do it. At the time I was beginning this journey, I didn't really have a lot of role models to look to as people who had made that kind of transition. And although I, had a fair amount of quantitative skills and technical skills, I didn't really feel like I was prepared or qualified in some sense to make a transition in my research program. And I didn't even know what that would look like or how to undertake that. So I think the way I addressed that was, as I said before, rather gradually. I started getting involved in things where I found a hook. So I was in the chemistry department at Illinois, and I learned that Charles David Keeling was a chemistry student at the University of Illinois. And so I teamed up with the Department of Atmospheric Sciences to launch a named lectureship called the Keeling Lecture. And so that started some conversations with colleagues in a discipline that's closer to these concerns. I went on to get involved in campus sustainability efforts, first through the Academic Senate and then through a new institute that emerged in sustainability, and worked on transforming campus energy systems and waste and water and things like that. So I tried to find the places where I could engage, given the skills that I had, without any kind of master plan in mind of how I could transition my scholarship. And over time, that my scholarship just became, my old scholarship, I should say, in astronomy and chemistry, just became a smaller part of my work life. And the sustainability work became a larger part of my work life. And you're right, this is a challenging thing for people who grow up in at least the American academic system, where the currency is all about publications and PhD students and grants and things like that. And I managed to keep both of these things going for a time until I could build up enough knowledge and experience in the area of sustainability that I was ultimately recruited to my current position at the University of Dayton to lead a sustainability institute and to switch to become a professor ultimately of sustainability rather than of chemistry, physics, and astronomy.
Wow, I mean it's quite a transition. Tom, what kind of obstacles have you encountered in your journey?
Well, many of the same ones that Ben described, but I would also say inertia, because I was in a fun little pocket of research. The proposals almost wrote themselves. I never had difficulty funding my experiments, and it was an easy path. I knew how to do it. I had established myself. I was in an environment that expected me to do that kind of thing and continue doing that kind of thing. And so for me, it became kind of a dual life situation. I kept the research thing just rolling through its own inertia and put in whatever effort I needed to just sort of maintain that, but I wasn't really fired up about the next steps. And, it's just sort of rolling along. The other part of my life was this set of concerns over our trajectory and some of the unspoken perils. Climate change gets plenty of attention, but it's just one symptom in there's a much more fundamental underlying disease that creates climate change and a lot of other ills. And so I'm really interested in getting at the root of what's causing all of these global scale problems. And so I started writing a blog, Do the Math, in 2011 that was very cathartic because I had been living with this for, at that point, about 7 years. And I needed to get it out. I needed to start communicating. I needed to start finding people who wanted to listen to this and comment on it. And so I think that was an opening for me to put me into this space. And I just gradually became more attracted to those kinds of things. Now, it's difficult in terms of scholarship. I've written a few articles that are related to this space, but I'm not keeping up the same kind of throughput that the institution expects. So there are still barriers. I'm not doing what a physicist is supposed to do as far as my department is concerned. So I don't care anymore. And so that's one of the things. But if I were younger, that's maybe part of what kept me away from this space for a long time, is because I still did care about career path and so forth.
Yes. Lots of questions I could ask, but I'm very intrigued that you've obviously come together as astrophysicists with shared set of concerns about the crisis that's coming down the tracks towards us. And you've established, you're both co-founders of the Planetary Limits Academic Network, or PLAN. So tell me something about PLAN, what it's about, and why you decided to set this up. Perhaps start with Ben.
Sure. Well, I think in terms of the origin story, if you like, of PLAN, it emerged from my dissatisfaction with the mainstream sustainability discourse that I was encountering in my roles in sustainability, in that most people tend to be very narrowly focused on technical responses to challenges, such as climate change. Indeed, many people are really narrowly focused on climate change, as Tom alluded to, which is really just one of the many aspects of this fundamental predicament that we face as a civilization. And I found myself, even within the sustainability community, rather isolated in my perspective on what was really happening in the world and what sorts of changes would be ultimately necessary if we were to avoid catastrophe as a civilization. So I started casting about for other academics who shared similar viewpoints. And I came across Tom, but I also came across an anthropologist and an environmental studies professor and a professor of fashion studies who had come to broadly similar conclusions about the state of the world and the trajectory of our global industrialized civilization if no adjustments were made. And so that led to the launch of what ultimately became PLAN. And I would say that one of our major goals as a network is to connect scholars across different disciplines, across geographic locales, who have come to this broad understanding, this holistic understanding of our existential challenges. And hopefully also we can help stimulate more transdisciplinary scholarship by bringing together not just astrophysicists, not just scientists at all, but social scientists, humanists, engineers, scholars in professional disciplines, and artists, and really across the academy, to bring their disciplinary tools together to better understand where we are, where we're headed, and ideally to develop some effective responses for this predicament that we're in. Also, as academics, we have important roles in shaping the education of today's youth. And so that's another area that we envision PLAN playing a major role in, helping to establish and facilitate the creation of curriculum that can be used to better educate our students about where we are.
Okay, thank you. Tom, perhaps if I could pick up with you then on one of the things that Ben just mentioned there, which is the bringing together academics not just scientists, but academics from a diverse range of disciplines. Why do you think that sort of multidisciplinary approach is so crucially important to plan?
Yeah, that's to me what's really very exciting about Plan is that this is not a bunch of scientists and engineers trying to devise technical solutions, because that's not where we need to go. We need to educate scientists on the more, I hate to use the word philosophical. Ben will know that I have my qualms with that. But in any case, we need scientists to understand what we as a human species are bringing to the problem and how we're creating some of the problems, and that it's about value systems and it's about attitudes and just who we think we are as a species, where we think we're going. Those are critical questions that need to be reframed in order to be successful in this. Meanwhile, I think the people on the other side, the non-scientists in Plan, might benefit from understanding that there are real hard physical limits. I mean, many of them who are attracted to Plan already get that, so we're not starting from scratch. But and likewise, the scientists attracted to Plan also understand this is not a technical problem that just needs, a solution. So we're starting from a good place, but I think there can be some really rich outcomes from those conversations, and each sort of field educating the other, bringing in that global perspective and broad interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary perspective. So it's not the usual interdisciplinary where you have two somewhat closely related fields doing some joint project. This is as broad as it gets, and it needs to be that broad because we're trying to address a systemic problem that spans all areas of human concern. And so you can't leave anybody out. And I do think academics have a special role to play here because we have the luxury of long-term thinking. Mm-hmm. We have some job security, modulo all the pressures and expectations. But we do have the potential, at least, to make a big difference.
Yes, of course, it's in a sense bringing together academics from different disciplines is a double-edged sword, because you do get that richness of perspective, as you say, but you also in the mix will undoubtedly find that there are people who have a different kind of mindset to the problems we have, and people who perhaps advocate for technological fixes. How do you as an academic community would you reconcile those different perspectives? So let's take an extremist view of the geosciences, for example, and sort of new approaches to mining, and this idea that we can continue to sustain our current ways of living just by doing things better and becoming better at extractivism. Is that potentially a risk, do you think, to Plan and to what you're doing? How do you reconcile those different perspectives?
I think that those different perspectives are present in folks from all sorts of different disciplines. So I'm not sure that those what you might call techno-optimistic perspectives are specific to a particular discipline or a specific type of discipline. What Plan has done so far is managed to collect a set of academics from all types of different disciplines who are already, in a sense, there. They've gone past that idea that we can continue business as usual just by making either technical changes or just by making policy changes. And so I think that's the secret sauce, is bringing together people from different disciplinary backgrounds who already have a more holistic understanding of the challenge.
Okay.
Ultimately, we would like to bring in those techno-optimists from different disciplines and help walk them through the process that we went through of concluding that there wouldn't be easy technical solutions or easy policy solutions to our current challenges. In the end, I would love it if Plan is a network that helps facilitate the kind of intellectual transitions that Tom and I went through, so that it doesn't have to take a decade or more for people to make that change. But through helping people through that intellectual transition and helping provide some gravitas, if you like, to this style of work, perhaps we can accelerate that transition.
Yeah, and let me just jump in there and say that one thing that we hope could happen for Plan is that it becomes a reputable collection of scholars doing interesting work that people are paying attention to. And so when a younger academic wants to maybe get involved in this work, they can sort of tuck into an existing, recognized, credible effort and have cover to basically change career paths without having to forge their own, breaking the path on their own, as Ben and I have done, and many others have done as well. But we hope to make that easier.
I think that's a great point. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in talking with scientists, like yourselves, is one of the things that comes up is that sense of isolation and the difficulties that scientists like you have in searching out other people who are like-minded. And so what I think you're doing is a fantastic initiative in sort of bringing people together and amplifying those voices. But at the same time, there's been a historical failure to adequately act, which means that there's a massive burden on future society, the young people and leaders of the future in terms of mitigation, the CO2 removal at scale and adaptation. And as you'll know, scientists have for decades warned about what's coming down the tracks, and yet the requisite action hasn't been taken. And I noticed on your website, you talk about the need for humanity to reframe decision-making processes and to value different things like ecosystem health and resilience, human rights, and true quality of life above traditional economic indicators. And you talk also about the potential for collapse and change. So I suppose the question is, what's different about Plan? Because we've had scientists' warnings for decades and they haven't been heeded. And as I often say, warnings simply don't work. What is it that gives you hope about Plan that your work and that what you're actually saying might actually be heeded in a positive and constructive way where others have failed?
That's a really profound question, Alison. I think that one of the key elements that differentiates Plan from previous efforts is that it is not just scientists, right? It's one thing for a group of scientists to come out and say, we have this problem, whether it's climate change, whether it's mass extinction, whether it's deforestation, whether it's loss of water resources, whatever it might be. That's simply a statement of fact. And I think that doesn't always resonate with either the general public or with policymakers. It evidently has not resonated sufficiently with those groups. So I think what gives me a little bit of hope about our effort is that we don't aim to just understand the scientific elements or describe the quantitative nature of particular problems that we face in the natural world or in the climate system or what have you. But instead, we want to try to understand the couplings between these problems in the natural systems and the challenges and the unique elements of the human systems that are intertwined with and exacerbate those challenges. And I think we have at least a fighting shot at doing that if we include social scientists, humanists, people from professional disciplines in the effort, not just scientists and engineers. How successful we will be, time will tell. But I think we are at least doing something a little bit different from previous efforts in this space.
Absolutely. Tom, would you like to comment on that? And particularly, I guess I'm thinking about academics in their conventional roles, which is to teach and to publish and to do research. Do you think that it's now? Do you think we're at the point now where academics actually need to think about what is their role in a time of climate and ecological emergency? And do you think academics need to do more in order to try to bring about these kinds of changes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, one thing that happens is we all get stuck into this mentality that's formed for generations, and it's been stable for generations in terms of where we see ourselves going. If we look backwards, we just see this sort of mounting trajectory of technological advance. And it just seems like sticking with that is the right thing to do. And at some point, that will no longer be the right thing to do. And I do think that academics and academic institutions are going to have a bit of soul searching to do in terms of what are we here? Why are we institutions? And if the business as usual trajectory is not possible, then why have we been just sort of feeding into it and facilitating it and promoting it and so forth? So I think, yes, we're going to have to come to terms with those big questions. And one of the advantages, I think, of building, as Ben said, it's more than just scientists and it's more than just warnings and facts. I learned through the Do the Math experience. I did a survey of personality types who visited my site and found that overwhelmingly, 75% of the visitors were from one small little corner of the personality type space, representing maybe 6% of the population. So 75% of the visitors were from a tiny fraction. So that kind of message is really good at resonating with a small set of people. And so I think that's partly why the warnings from scientists just aren't landing, they're not sticking. So I think by bringing in other disciplines of even cognitive science and psychology and understanding how minds work and understanding, the neuroscience can help us build stories that people can understand and digest. Because right now, some of our central messages are so alien to the normal mindset that people don't have any place to put it. And it just gets rejected. It's just not, it doesn't connect. It's not internalized. And it's just shoved off as, no, I don't understand. That's not the world that I understand. And so we need to craft ways to connect to people's identities and maybe reframe how important they think humans are in this universe. I think that's one of the fundamental pieces that we have backwards. We have inverted as humans above the rest of nature. Well, we're just a part of it and we can't operate without it. And so we need to flip the hierarchy. And that's one of the key mental shifts that will be necessary, I think, before any progress is made on landing these messages of warning. Absolutely.
And I think you're absolutely right about the need for a kind of a new narrative. And so I see, plan as in part potentially delivering on that new narrative so that, so that we can actually imagine what the future might actually be. And it might not be quite as scary and horrific as some might think it could be.
Right. It's only scary if you're really wedded to the dream that we currently hold, which is the wrong dream. It's just the wrong dream, and that's what's got to get replaced.
It's very strange, isn't it? And I'm reminded of a paper recently by a whole bunch of people. It's a multidisciplinary group of people, including I think it's Isaac Stoddard, Kerry Facer, and Kevin Anderson. And it's this narrative about progress, which is actually seriously detrimental to humanity. I mean, that is in a nutshell is essentially the problem, that progress is not good for us. The way in which we imagine progress to be.
Right.
The last question I'd like to talk to you about then, or just put to you, is about the advice that you would give to other people who potentially looking to do something similar to you. Looking for groups of academics, like-minded individuals, and who want to make a difference. What advice would you give to other people? other than contacting you and joining your group?
I think, reflecting on my, so to speak, transition, I think the most useful thing that people can do who are contemplating this type of transition is to find people who have undertaken at least a similar transition. Maybe no one will have exactly the same career path that you're contemplating. But that was an area where I really struggled, was finding folks who had completely shifted their area of scholarship or even their career focus. I think that's the really critical thing, to learn from folks who have been down that road before. And that's one of the things that I hope we can help with Plan, is to provide some models for what those transitions might look like, and to provide some advice to younger scientists or people from any disciplines who are really interested in moving in this direction.
Sounds like a good piece of advice. And Tom?
Yeah, somewhat complementary. And I think I agree with that, looking to other examples. But the other piece of advice I'd give is learn to be an independent thinker. Step back, take a big perspective, think about humanity on long time scales. Don't get sort of narrowly focused into what you've known during your life. Look at the big picture and what's possible, and be willing to shake off the sort of cultural norms of who we think we are, where we think we're going. And because some of these things are actually pretty obvious once you can do that. And I think the rest of it almost takes care of itself, in terms of realizing some of the fallacies that we and the myths that we tend to believe. So yeah, just be bold, think big, and be original in your thinking.
Super, thank you. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I mean, I'm always in awe of scientists who make these radical career decisions and make these radical changes, and people who sort of put themselves on the line and are trying to do the right thing for all life on the planet. So thank you so much for your time. And
that's the key thing, all life on the planet, not just human life. We're all in this together, and we need to respect each other and do the best for the collective, not just one species. Thank you.